Hey everybody, welcome to Monday 11 a.m. the No Shill Zone with Ben, Cowen, and myself. Hope everyone is doing wonderfully well. How are you doing, Ben?
Pretty good. I've been pretty sick over the last week or so, but slowly recovering. How about you?
Good, man. Yeah, kind of same thing. Things come and go when you got kids, and for those of you out there with kids, you know how it goes. They bring home something. They're very kind to us. They give us things
Yeah.
they pick up at school. So,
Yeah,
um,
people
so,
always they
so
always
let's.
ask me, how do you get sick so much? I'm like, well, try having 4 kids that are 7 and under.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know?
Although you're gonna have the best immune system ever in a
Yeah.
few years.
Well, anyways, Gareth, I thought we should sort of pick back up because I know on Monday last week, you were pretty vocal about being long on various cryptocurrencies, on Bitcoin, on some of the altcoins, and it looks like that's paid off pretty well. Can you kind of update us on how things have gone here?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So for me, anyways, and that was exactly what it was. Is I was long Bitcoin based on, if we look at this chart, right? So we had this down sloping trend line, and I think it's important for us to say is like you can have a macro, bigger picture view that something could happen, and then you can have an even bigger macro, right? So in general, I've been very skeptical that we're in a new bull market, but that doesn't mean that when the charts are telling me we're going to have a pop, I'm not going to go long, right? And so that's exactly what I did. And again, even though I'm kind of midterm questioning whether or not this is a new bull market, I'm also long term insanely bullish, and I think that's the same way you are. So it's all about time frame, folks. And again, we had this down sloping trend line. Once we got above it, that was a short term breakout. And I went long and then sold half the position with members at 31,000, half at 34. And then I actually got off a short just above 35,000. Now it was back on the 24th when we just peaked above 35,000. So I'm slightly short, a very small kind of dip your toe in the water. This morning, I just exited the Cardano long position. I talked about this with you guys about how you had this wedge pattern. We broke out. We went right up to this trend line. So for me, it becomes kind of a 50-50 now. So I said, you know what? Once it's a gamble and it's a 50-50 probability, sure, it could go higher, but I'm not going to be greedy about it. And I exited there. I still am holding a little bit of Litecoin. It is slightly in the money here. I'm thinking you might get one pop here. But again, I will say this, I'm starting to also look to short things. I think Chainlink is getting a little overdone to the upside. So again, it's being a trader's mentality, but a trader can make money in any market. And here's a great example.
With Bitcoin, is that yellow trend line that you had, is that sort of the reversion back to the scene of the crime? Like, do you think that's going to offer some type of technical resistance for a
Yeah.
while?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the big question, right? And I think you would agree with this. Is so this trend line here starts in that first initial dip after, I think this was FTX. This high connected to this high comes right through here, and that's really what we're bubbling up against. So that's right around that 35,000 level, and so that's resistance. But my big question is this: to me, this run up is purely based on speculation or anticipation, maybe is the better word, that we're going to get that spot ETF. So people are buying on the rumor, essentially, the pre-news. And the question is, when we get that news, we could easily see a pop higher, but I wonder if it doesn't become a sell after the news is already out there. So let's say we pop up to even 40,000 and wick up there. Do we reverse? And I'd love to have your input on this. Is like what are your thoughts on, do you agree that this is a speculative move on the ETF? And then when we get that ETF, which I think we both agree we will get at some point, what does price do after that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think there is a lot of speculation related to the ETF. I also think, based on the fact that the dominance of Bitcoin is trending higher, that it's still people leaving altcoins for Bitcoin, generally
Mhm.
speaking. And that doesn't mean that some altcoins aren't going up. I mean, I think last week, when ADA was at like 25 cents, you said you were long until 30 cents, and now it's at 30 cents. So,
Yeah.
um, but with the dominance last week, it was at 52%. And now it's at around 54%. This chart I've shown a few times this year, and it's basically just looking at averages of Bitcoin in pre-halving years. And sort of coming into the year, I suggested that the range for the year would be between 12K and 35K, and 35K is about 2.1x off the yearly open, which is where the 2015-2019 average ultimately topped out. I don't want to say that it can't go higher because I was sort of thinking there was a good chance that the yearly highs were already in. So I don't want to necessarily like limit and say that Bitcoin can't go higher, but we are of course entering into a period where we have historically seen pullbacks with Bitcoin. Now that doesn't mean everything, right? We know that September is normally a red month, and it wasn't this year. But November is also not normally the best month for Bitcoin unless it's in a full-fledged bull market, right? Like if you back to like 2020, 2017, November was a great month. But if you think back to 2019, 2018, 2022, 2021, November was pretty bad month. So I think it ultimately comes down to really where the macro takes us, right? Like and where does the stock market go? Does the stock market keep selling off, or does it catch a bid into the end of the year?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is that if you look at November, we know that November, like you said, has been a key month historically, and that's when Bitcoin topped in 2021, right? And so
Right.
you also kind of draw that conclusion and saying, okay, what if we got an ETF announcement in November? You see this huge pop up because you will get chasers, right? The question is, does it hold? And so imagine if we do that big kind of pop, let's say into the 40s, and then it just wicks, and then you have a new top shorter term before you start trading down. And again, I don't know if that will happen, but it is kind of worth seeing. And let me just show my chart here. This would be my kind of most bullish case for Bitcoin. Take the kind of this high from 2019 and connect it through the lows of the bull market. And if we drag that across, you have kind of this beautiful little trend line going right through these lows of the bull market. And that's right around 47,000. And again, that to me would be like spot ETF approved, and it just pops crazy on this crazy buying, like, oh my goodness. And then I could see that being a short-term high on the market. I would probably look to add aggressively to my short if it popped up there that high.
Yeah, what do you think? There's a pretty strong likelihood that it makes it that high on an ETF approval?
It's tough. I mean, I honestly think it's even a little extended, but the more it kind of chops sideways, the more I think that it could go up here a little bit further. But that would be kind of that would be like the roses, like everything coming up roses for it. Like if everything was just perfectly aligned, maybe if the news hit when there was light volume and it really got that crazy momentum, I could see that potentially happening. The other thing I wanted to show you on Bitcoin dominance here, I know you look at this all the time, but we've talked about our targets on Bitcoin dominance and how they coexist here. And you're actually not that far away. This is the weekly Bitcoin dominance chart. And I think you're still in the camp that we're probably going to see this like 57, 58 level percent wise on dominance. And look at the three trend lines from the low of 2018 through this area here, and then this pivot low and this downsloping level. And they're all converging right at that level. And again, is that still kind of where you're thinking this is going?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of bullish on the Bitcoin dominance through the end of the year. Really, I mean, I might remain bullish on it until the Fed pivot, but that could also correspond to the end of the year. I don't know. It depends on what the stock market does. Yeah, I'm pretty bullish on the Bitcoin dominance. Around 60% has been my target. Could be a little bit less, could be a little bit more. I don't really know exactly where it'll top out, but I mean, look, if Bitcoin makes the move to that trend line that you drew, I have no doubt that it'll get to,
Yeah.
to 58%. Because I think the interesting thing is, while Bitcoin has put in higher lows and higher highs this year, Ethereum has been putting in lower highs and lower lows since April, you
Yeah.
know? So, and I think it kind of goes back to like, when people say, well, is it a bull market? I think we have to question, well, in what? Because some things are putting in lower or higher highs and higher lows. Other things are putting in lower highs and lower lows. So I think it really depends on what people are talking about when they reference that, because the Ethereum Bitcoin valuation has been an absolute capitulation basically since the merge, right? Remember that event? It's speaking about like major events like the spot ETF. The merge was a huge event for Ethereum, where a lot of people were very, very bullish and saying that it was going to fundamentally change everything. And look, that's where it topped out,
Yeah.
back in September. So a lot of
That's
times these things are sort of buy the rumor, sell the news.
and what you're showing here is exactly why I think investors, and if you're watching this, I think you probably follow us enough to know this, but you just want to be careful when that news hits, not jumping on the bandwagon at that point. Like really, Bitcoin's already had a substantial move from 25 now to 35. If it goes up to 41, 42, that's probably based on what you're showing on Ethereum and what happened there. You have to be a little careful because sell the news is a legit thing. You see it in stocks all the time. You see it in commodities, like with commodities, for instance, just using like oil. oil topped recently when OPEC actually cut production. Right. It was kind of the run up into everyone knowing they were going to cut production. They cut production, and then that was the high. So just be aware of that. Again, it depends on your time horizon. Obviously, is it going to matter in 10 years if you went in long 41 versus 35? Probably not that much, but at least in the short term, it is important to remember.
What's your view on the stock market here? Because, normally as you get into like late October, November, December, there's some type of seasonality that kicks in, but we haven't necessarily seen it kick in yet. Do you think it's going to kick in, or is it just kind of just slowly dropping here?
Yeah, interesting chart here on the S&P. So the S&P, right, we have this level here, and I'll just refresh here. So you have this pivot high, and this is something we pierced on Friday, but we've recaptured today. So we're right into this really big support area on the S&P, or the spiders, which is right around this 410 level. So I'm really following this. If we break this, we're headed all the way to 400 on the SPY, which would basically be 4,000 or sub 4,000 on the S&P. But I think you have this window where yields may have topped at 5%. If they topped and we do start to see the 10-year coming in, then you can easily see the potential for the markets to bounce into year end on that narrative. I think a couple things have to happen. The Fed is on Wednesday. They have to not be brutal to the markets. They have to leave the door open for maybe pausing and being totally done. The next would be Apple earnings on Thursday after the bell. They have to be not horrendous, right? And then Friday morning is the jobs report. And we've seen such good jobs numbers, meaning strong jobs numbers. If we could get one that's just a little weak, I think you have a top. And I think the markets actually rally on the back of that, at least in the near term.
Normally, when the Fed clearly advertises a pause, I do believe that the market does see some type of move back up to the upside.
Yeah.
I know since the Fed really paused this time, at least so far, the market has fallen. But I also think that the market is unsure as to whether the Fed's even going to raise again or not. So perhaps they will provide some clarity. I think that the labor market has been relatively resilient. But I think the one thing that I've looked at a lot recently are these continued claims, because this is something, and I think we spoke about this a little bit last week, how it sort of bottomed out here in September of 22. And now it looks like it's potentially bottoming out here in September of 2023. And, if this continues to go up, basically what it shows is that people who are getting laid off are having a harder and harder time finding a new job, right? And there's some, there's just continued claims.
Yep.
I do think it's worthwhile to look at what's going on this week in the labor market.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to keep a close eye on is delving into the numbers. Like, one of the things that I've talked about in the last few jobs reports is the part-time jobs have actually been going up dramatically. But if you look at full-time work, we've actually seen full-time jobs declining, actually losses in full-time jobs. So again, this is where, the headline number is what the markets seem to cue off of, but really it's looking under the belly of it to see this. And this is exactly what you're talking about with continuing claims as well.
Right. Yeah. The S&P, by the way, is, what was it? I don't know, 41, 47. I think, sort of thinking about when people say, like, is it a bull market? And we say, like, well, in what, the Russell is basically back at the October 2022 lows, and I think a lot of times in sort of macro bull markets that take you to new highs, you would actually expect to see an improvement in breadth, right? You would expect to see lower market cap stocks do really well, because that represents a large part of the economy as well, and if they keep getting sold off and are putting in new lows, then you have to wonder, like, well, where is the bull market if it's not coming from, a lot of these smaller companies?
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. So here's the IWM, which is the Russell ETF. And what you see here is that this basically had the dip from the all-time highs, right? And we bottomed out. And then while the NASDAQ rallied and the S&P rallied sharply higher, this one just chopped sideways, which is a classic bear flag formation. And then you could see the line here, it broke. So, this would tell me that while we could see a little bit of a short-term bounce, if the jobs number is a little bit lighter, if the Fed isn't too crazy, you probably don't look to say, oh, this is a new bull market on stocks. This is very clear that the Russell is 2,000 stocks. The S&P is only 500 and the NASDAQ 100 is only 100. And so this is the widest view of the overall market, and it is not a good view. So again, this would tell me that while we could get a short-term rally, your midterm is probably further downside.
Right. What's your view on gold? Because I know like it had a pretty big sell off a few weeks ago, and I know you thought it was a sort of a buy the dip opportunity. It seems like that has been proven true. What's your view on gold now that it's back around 2000?
Yeah, I continue to be I continue to be really bullish on gold. I mean, the fundamentals were for me were that, obviously inflation is probably higher for longer. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing for being out of gold. I think it's a positive for gold. While rates are high, gold's performance, usually when rates go up, gold gets trounced, and gold wasn't getting trounced. If you zoom out on the chart, you stayed in this upper range while rates just kept going higher and higher. And same thing with the dollar, by the way. Look at the dollar's performance and then look at how well gold is held up. So these were all positives. Throw into the mix that central banks, like if you look at what central banks have been doing, they've been buying gold hand over fist. And it's kind of like the dumb moment where it's like, wait, so the people that are in charge of the money printers are buying massive amounts of gold. That probably tells me everything I want to know. And then you look at formations and you see the head and shoulders, right? So head is here. Here's a shoulder. Let me see if I can actually draw it in here for you guys. But basically you have this pattern, which again is inverse head and shoulders are bullish, right? While head and shoulders are bearish. But this is an inverse potential head and shoulders. And you can see again, if the breakout occurs, I mean, we could be at 2,500 next month. And I was lucky enough to buy a fair amount of gold right down at this low. And I'm just going to try to ride it. I'm not a hodler by much. I have a tiny bit of Bitcoin I've hodled for the last, since we were at those lows around 17, 18,000. And then gold is really my only other hodl position. Otherwise, I swing trade,
Right. Yeah. I mean, with crypto, the only thing I've even bought in the last like 2 years is Bitcoin. Like I haven't even been interested in the altcoin market. Mostly because I'm not much of a short-term trader, but also because of the sort of the dominance view. As far as gold, I keep looking at and I know I've been bullish on this one as well for a while as well. I think that the more we keep testing this 2000 level, eventually it's got to break, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, you can only knock on the door so many times before it's going to break out. And I think that it's likely going to happen relatively soon. I mean, gold is one of the things that, I mean, it can sell off into a recession, which is potentially this sell-off, for all we know. But once that recession is actually here and QE is back, gold normally skyrockets,
Right.
based on what we've historically seen. And I think a lot of people look at gold again and they don't really see a whole lot of happening over here. But look what gold was doing during this decade where stocks were mostly flat, right? I mean, just sort of overlaying the S&P onto this chart. Look what gold did during this time. Just was
Yeah.
on
Awesome.
one massive parabolic bull run, while the stock market was basically flat for 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, that's an awesome chart, in fact. And I think I see a comment here: gold is not a good investment historically. Yeah, you're right, but you have to also look at it and say, okay, what was going on? So once the U.S. went off the gold standard, okay, but then it became this reserve currency of the world and strengthened against pretty much all these other currencies, which then held it down. Now you have almost the opposite. I would almost say it's going to look for a reversion to the mean type scenario on gold. At least that's how I view it, where you probably see while it underperformed for so long, it might actually outperform going forward. And by the way, I think that's wonderfully bullish for Bitcoin over the longer term too.
Well, I mean, I think markets are cyclical, right? I mean, if something hasn't performed in 10 years, it doesn't mean it'll never perform well again. Gold has a rich history of going through, 10, 15-year bull markets and then doing nothing for the next 20 years.
Yeah.
So,
And I think a good question here saying, what happens if gold when Bitcoin takes over? So I don't view it as taking over, right? So, you're not going to see a portfolio, and I have a hedge fund, right? So I have this portfolio that I'm in charge of, and you don't say, oh, well, Bitcoin's taking over, so let me put all my money in Bitcoin, right? Portfolio managers will allocate a certain percentage. And I think the allocation group is growing exponentially because of the debt of the US, because of the dollar potential, degrading. And so, what might have been 5% of the portfolio with just gold could easily become 10% of the portfolio with 5 and 5 to Bitcoin and gold. And so I think it's important to realize is that you're not going to all of a sudden snap your fingers and be like, oh, we're only going to buy gold. That's not how fund managers work or
right.
Bitcoin.
Right. Yeah, I'm curious about one stock in particular because it's one of the more talked about stocks, Tesla. Tesla is one that and the reason it's catching my eye today is because it's actually back below 200, which seems to be kind of an important level. What's your view on Tesla here? Because it's been putting in lower highs here for a little while.
Yeah, so one of the things we saw was a trend line here on. In fact, I can actually stretch this trend line all the way back to
Yeah,
the all-time highs in 2021. And then you can see when you dipped in early 2023, we hit about $100 on Tesla. And if you take that trend line up, there was a wedge pattern and it came right into the tip of that wedge and broke down. And so as soon as that happened, that's a bear. I mean, really bearish to see that wedge pattern break down versus breaking up. So now you're now starting to look at this down sloping trend line here, which connects through this pivot to this pivot and this pivot. And that's probably your short term target. And again, that's more for a swing trade. It
right.
doesn't tell me where Tesla will be in 2 years from now. But if we hit 170, 171, I'd probably be a buyer for a bounce on that. But I wouldn't touch it here, not the way it's acting.
It seems like, I mean, it seems like even this massive rally that we've had from 100 to 300 was still just a lower high, right?
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. It was a classic retrace. In fact, I didn't do a fib, but I'd love to I'm just curious if there's a fib level retrace here. Yeah, kind of look at that right up to the 618. The highest point on the bounce was a 618 Fibonacci retrace to really to almost the penny. And that was the high right there. Wow. That's just cool to see. And again, I don't use fibs all the time, but it's really interesting when you get these bigger moves. Now, Ben, as we kind of come to the end here, I wanted you to show a chart. I saw you post this on Twitter. It was the chart with M2 versus the S&P 500. Do you happen to have that chart by any chance?
Yeah, I just
There it is.
yeah.
That
Yeah,
is like the coolest chart ever.
yeah, well, I think the reason why I like to look at this chart is, I mean, look at the history. Like that just kind of shows you how insane the dot-com bubble was,
Yeah.
right? Like just to look at kind of where we are today. But yeah, it's an interesting chart because it really does show you that a lot of the reasons that we've seen the stock market go up at various time frames are just because of money printing. And it's sort of like an illusion, like stock market gains in recent years, because the only reason it went up was arguably due to all the money printing. Think about this. When you account for M2, the high that we saw in late 2021, early 2022 was the same as the pre-pandemic high, and the same high was basically hit here in 2023. So for whatever reason, this does seem to be a pretty important level. Now, if we were to come back down to say this yellow line down here, we hit it in December 2018, we hit it in October of 2022. We even went below it here in March of 2020. But if we were to go back down to that level, that's another 18% drop.
Wow.
But we also have to remind ourselves that the money supply has actually gone down in over the last year or so. So I mean, just for reference, right, an 18% drop by the stock market would actually get you to a new low, right? So even though it would get you to the same level as it was in October of 2022, when you account for M2 went down, right? So if we go to that same level, accounting for the denominator, it actually puts you, in fact, at a new low.
It
which
looks
to me,
like, and sorry to interrupt, I was going to say, it looks like that was just the high before COVID, the COVID collapse too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly where it is. And you can even maybe sort of connect the dots here, right? I look at this chart and I think that I'm still of the camp that a lower low could come for the S&P 500. And the reason why I think it's a possibility, it's not like a sure thing. There's no such thing as a sure thing with investing. But I think the reason why it's a possibility that we all should consider is because recessions are notorious for taking. That's what happens in a recession, is we put in a new low, with stocks. So if that were to happen, I think that it wouldn't be that surprising. And we've talked before about like sort of that pre-pandemic high as being a potential target, 3,300, 3,400, if something like this were to play out. And who knows how long it takes to play out. Maybe it takes a year. Maybe we pull in 1987 and it takes a week, 1987, the stock market dropped 20% the third week of October, I believe. So and that was also a pre-election year. And the Fed had been raising rates a lot. So I mean, again, like I think sort of assuming the worst case scenario like 1987 has to play out is probably a fool's errand, because oftentimes the market doesn't crash, right? People spend forever saying the market has to crash, and it crashes like one time every 2 to 3 years or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But it is something relevant to think about. Okay, well, if there is a recession that materializes either this year or next year, then it is possible the S&P could go and put in a new low.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I think that's so interesting, and I think you're right on that. Is that how much of even crypto Twitter is focused on the next bull market, but there's like mini bull markets in between. There's mini bear. I mean, there's so many trading opportunities. Same thing with stock markets. I mean, so many people focused on we're going to crash and this and that, and it's like, dude, just like trade the shorter term and ignore those bigger things because those are like it's the equivalent of winning the lottery. It doesn't really happen very often. Maybe once in a generation. So I think that's a great way to kind of conclude here today, folks. As again, we watch, remember, Federal Reserve Wednesday, Apple earnings Thursday after the close, Friday morning jobs report, and then obviously keep an eye out for the potential of a ETF being approved. I don't know when it will be approved, but my guess is it will. I just don't know if it's before year end. Do you think it's before year end, Ben?
I hope so, honestly. I mean,
Yeah.
I would like for us to just get it behind us and focus on other things
You,
in crypto other than the on the I mean, I think it will likely lead to a lot of liquidity in the short term. I think it could also lead to a lot of supply as well. One of the reasons why you could argue that Bitcoin's being bid up is the premium on GBTC sort of closing. So that could be leading to some buying pressure. I also just wanted to mention this is some of the major economic events this week. You're right. I mean, there's nothing really today. But really starting Wednesday, we get ADP employment, we get job openings, ISM manufacturing. We also have FOMC on Wednesday. I mean, this is going to be a crazy week. And Thursday, initial jobless claims. And then Friday, we get non-farm payroll, unemployment rate, hourly wages, and all that other stuff. And so the last thing I wanted to mention is just a short-term pattern that I've just noticed over the last 2 weeks. It doesn't mean that it'll continue to play out. But, in terms of these macro events, there's nothing really for Monday and Tuesday. It all starts like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I just happened to notice that the stock market the last 2 weeks, Monday and Tuesday were green. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday were red. And then the week before that, it was Monday and Tuesday were green. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday were red. So I'll be interested to see if that pattern plays out or if we kind of switch gears and do something different than we've done the last couple of weeks. But anyways, guys, if you're not subscribed to Gareth, make sure you go do so. Links to his socials are in the description below, and we will be back next Monday.
Heck yeah, guys. Same thing for Ben. Links to socials. Go check out his service. It's awesome. And yeah, thank you guys for tuning in. We appreciate it. And we'll see you next week. Take